My name is Mia. I'm in my mid-30s, and for most of my adult life, I've been described with the same words: steady, easygoing, low maintenance. I'm the woman people trust to keep things running without asking for credit. The one who listens more than she speaks. The one who notices details others skip over, and rarely announces that she has. If you'd met me before all of this happened, you might have underestimated me. Not because I'm weak, but because I'm calm, because I don't rush to correct people when they misunderstand me. Because I've learned that silence can look like softness to those who don't know how to read it. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about yelling, exposing secrets, or winning in the loud way people expect. It's about something quieter, slower, more unsettling than anger. It's about what happens when someone realizes, too late, that the person they tried to erase was the one holding everything together. I secretly recorded a conversation and heard my mother-in-law teaching my husband how to kick me out. That sentence alone sounds dramatic. I know that. But I need you to understand something before we go any further. I didn't record that conversation because I was suspicious, jealous, or looking for a fight. I pressed play, expecting suspicion. What I heard instead was a step-by-step plan to erase me from my own home. This story unfolds over time, quietly, in small moments that didn't look dangerous when they first happened. A look held too long, a suggestion framed as concern. A decision made without my input was then explained away as practical. It's the story of how I was slowly repositioned, from partner to inconvenience to obstacle, without anyone ever raising their voice. You'll hear how I was seen by my husband's family, what role was expected to play, how easily kindness is mistaken for compliance, and how invisibility can be both a wound and, unexpectedly, a form of cover. I'm telling this the way it actually felt: restrained, observational, sometimes painfully ordinary. There are no villains twirling mustaches here, no sudden miracles, just people making choices they assumed I wouldn't understand or wouldn't challenge. And you'll hear about the moment everything changed, not outwardly, internally. The moment I stopped reacting and started paying attention. The moment silence stopped being something I endured and became something I chose. I'm sharing this not to punish anyone and not to recruit sympathy. I'm sharing it because stories like this often get told only after they explode. And most of the damage actually happens long before that, when no one thinks anything is happening at all. As you listen, I want to ask you something gently and without pressure. Have you ever realized, a little too late, that the people around you had already decided who you were allowed to be? To my husband's family, I was easy to define. Not because they knew me well, but because I fit neatly into a shape they already understood. I was the calm one, the agreeable one, the woman who didn't cause friction. At dinners, I was the person who cleared plates without being asked, who remembered everyone's preferences, who noticed when the conversation was drifting toward something uncomfortable and gently redirected it, usually with a question about someone else. I laughed at the right moments. I nodded when opinions were stated as facts. I didn't interrupt. And because of that, people assumed I didn't have much to say. My mother-in-law liked to introduce me with a smile that lingered just a second too long. "This is Mia," she'd say. "She's very low-key, very adaptable." Adaptable. That word followed me everywhere. It sounded like praise, but it functioned like a boundary. Adaptable people adjust. They don't resist. They don't insist. They don't need to be consulted because they'll be fine either way. At first, I accepted that framing. Not because I believed it fully, but because it made things smoother. I grew up learning that harmony was a kind of currency, and I spent it freely. I told myself that not every hill needed to be defended, that being flexible was a strength. What I didn't realize then was that flexibility, when left unchecked, becomes expectation. My husband saw me in a similar way, though more kindly, I think. He trusted me to handle things, to manage logistics, to absorb stress without complaint. When decisions needed to be made quickly, he'd often say, "Mia's good either way," before I'd even had a chance to answer. I noticed it. I just didn't challenge it. In group settings, I was often spoken around rather than to. Plans would be discussed in my presence, as if I were part of the furniture, important, useful, but not autonomous. If I offered an opinion, it was acknowledged politely and then gently overridden. No one was cruel about it. That's the part that makes it hard to explain. Cruelty leaves bruises you can point to. This was more like erosion, slow, almost courteous. My mother-in-law had a way of praising me that subtly reduced me at the same time. "She doesn't need much," she'd say. "She's not demanding. She's very understanding. Each sentence placed me further away from the category of someone whose needs might matter. And I let it happen, because from the outside, my life looked good. Stable marriage, nice home, no shouting, no scandals, no obvious conflict. I told myself that noticing these things meant I was being sensitive, that maybe I was reading too much into tone and phrasing and seating arrangements. After all, no one was excluding me outright. I was still invited, still included, still present, just slightly off-center, slightly unnecessary. I became the person others felt comfortable making decisions for. Not because I lacked intelligence or awareness, but because I rarely disrupted the flow. I didn't force pauses. I didn't demand clarification. I filled in gaps instead of pointing them out. And over time, that taught them something about me. They learned that I would adapt faster than I would object. They learned that I would observe before I would react. They learned that my silence could be mistaken for consent. What they never bothered to learn was why I was quiet. They assumed it was passivity, or gratitude, or lack of ambition. They didn't consider that it might be a restraint. I was always listening, always cataloging, not in a paranoid way, just in the way someone does when they've learned that patterns matter more than promises. I noticed who spoke when I left the room. I noticed which decisions were made casually and which were deferred. I noticed how often my presence was useful and how rarely it was centered. At the time, I didn't label it as disrespect. That word felt too strong, too confrontational. I told myself it was just family dynamics, just personality differences. But looking back, this was the foundation. This was the version of me they were comfortable with, reliable, calm, adjustable, quietly grateful. A woman who would never imagine that she might one day be seen as something to remove. The first moment didn't arrive with drama. There was no argument, no raised voice, no sharp line crossed that everyone in the room could see. That's why it stayed with me. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, the kind that blends into memory if you're not paying attention. My mother-in-law had come over unannounced, which wasn't unusual. She had a way of treating our home as an extension of her own. Nothing aggressive, just familiar enough to feel unquestioned. She stood in the kitchen, looking around thoughtfully, like someone evaluating a space they might renovate. "You know," she said casually, "this place would feel much more open if the furniture were arranged differently." I smiled, not because I agreed, but because smiling was my default response to commentary that wasn't really a question. She continued, "When my son lived alone, he liked things simple, clean lines, not too many personal touches." She said personal touches while glancing, briefly, at the bookshelf I'd organized, the framed photos I'd chosen, the small details that made the house feel like ours instead of a temporary stop. My husband was there, sitting at the table, scrolling on his phone. He didn't look up. I waited, just a second longer than necessary, waiting for him to say something, anything, even a neutral, "We like it this way." Instead, he shrugged. "We can think about it." The word landed strangely, because I hadn't been part of any thinking, not before and not now. It was small, incredibly small. The kind of moment you'd feel silly bringing up later, so I didn't. I told myself it wasn't worth making me uncomfortable, that no harm had been intended, that his mother was just making conversation. But something about the ease of it, the way my space was evaluated, my preferences implied rather than asked, stayed with me. Later that evening, when my mother-in-law had left, I mentioned it lightly. "Did you notice your mom was kind of redesigning the house today?" I kept my tone neutral, curious, not accusatory. My husband laughed. "She does that everywhere. It doesn't mean anything." That was the moment I felt the first cut. Not from his mother, but from him. Because it wasn't about what she said. It was about how quickly my experience was dismissed, how smoothly it was reframed as nothing. I nodded, let it go like I always did. After that, small things started to happen more often. Comments about how I didn't mind certain arrangements. Decisions were made based on what was easiest for everyone else, under the assumption that I'd adjust. Conversations that started with, "You're okay with this, right?" after the decision had already been made. Each time I felt the same hesitation, the same internal debate. Is this worth addressing? Am I overreacting? Would saying something make me look difficult? And each time I chose silence, not because I didn't care, but because I cared about being reasonable, about not being the person who turned minor issues into major ones. Everyone else seemed comfortable with how things were. They moved through the space as if it belonged to them, just a little more than it belonged to me. And I told myself that noticing didn't mean there was a problem, that awareness wasn't the same as accusation. But awareness, once it begins, doesn't go away. I started remembering things more clearly, filing them mentally instead of brushing them aside. Not with resentment, just with attention. The first cut didn't bleed, it didn't demand a response, but it changed how I looked at what came after. Once something happens more than once, it stops feeling like an anomaly. It starts to feel like a pattern. At first, I told myself that nothing had changed, that I was just more aware. But awareness has a way of sharpening what was already there, and soon I couldn't unsee how easily my comfort was traded for convenience. It showed up in conversations that moved forward without me. Plans were discussed between my husband and his mother, then presented to me as conclusions. Not demands, never that, but assumptions. We thought it would be easier if... It makes more sense this way. You don't really mind, right? Each sentence carried the same quiet message. Your agreement is expected, not required. And every time I hesitated, even briefly, the room shifted. Not dramatically, just enough for me to feel like I'd interrupted something smooth. So I learned to smooth it again. I rationalized my silence carefully. I told myself that compromise was part of marriage, that family dynamics were complicated, that not everything needed to be equal to be fair. I reminded myself of all the ways my husband was good to me. He wasn't cruel, he didn't shout, he didn't insult me. Compared to the stories other women told, my life seemed blessed. That comparison became my cage. Whenever discomfort surfaced, I'd counter it with gratitude. Other people have it worse. Whenever I felt overlooked, I'd translate it into generosity. They trust me to handle things. Whenever my needs went unasked, I reframed it as independence. I don't need much. Slowly, I became fluent in explaining myself out of my own emotions. My mother-in-law grew more comfortable directing the flow of our household, suggesting schedules, recommending routines, referring to our home as if it were a shared project between her and her son. She's just trying to help, my husband would say. And maybe she was, but help, when unsolicited and unreciprocated, can feel a lot like control. The most unsettling part was how normal it all became. How easily everyone, including me, adjusted to a version of reality where my presence was supportive but not central. I noticed that when decisions affected me directly, they were often framed as practical necessities rather than choices, as if circumstances, not people, were responsible. It's just how things are. It's not personal. There's no other option. Those phrases discouraged questions. They closed the doors quietly, and I let them, because every time I considered pushing back, I pictured the alternative: tension, awkwardness, being labeled as difficult. I had spent years cultivating an image of calm competence. I didn't want to lose it over something that couldn't be easily explained. Disrespect, when it's subtle, is hard to defend against. It arrives disguised as reasonableness. It asks you to prove harm that hasn't fully materialized yet. So instead of confronting it, I adapted to it. I learned to anticipate decisions before they were announced, to adjust my expectations in advance, to make peace with outcomes I hadn't chosen. From the outside, I probably looked unbothered, even content. From the inside, something was being slowly rewritten. I wasn't angry, not yet. Anger would have required clarity. What I felt was more diffuse, a quiet dissonance between how I experienced my life and how it was being narrated around me. And still I stayed quiet, because silence had worked for me before, because patience felt safer than conflict, because I believed that if I kept showing up with grace, eventually I'd be seen. What I didn't realize was that my silence wasn't buying me respect. It was teaching them what they could take. Roles don't always get announced. Most of the time, they're handed out gradually, through repetition, through what's expected of you, and what no one ever expects you to push back on. By the time I noticed the role I'd been given, I was already playing it well. I was the reliable one, the emotional buffer, the person who absorbed the inconvenience so others wouldn't have to. If there was a conflict brewing, I was expected to smooth it. If someone needed flexibility, it was assumed I'd provide it. Not because anyone asked me to, but because I always had. My mother-in-law spoke about me with a certain tone, fond, approving, but also final. She's very easy, she'd say. She doesn't get upset over little things. She understands how families work. Each sentence quietly positioned me as someone who would endure rather than interrupt. My husband leaned into that version of me without realizing it. When his mother suggested something that inconvenienced me, he'd look at me with a small, reassuring smile, as if to say, "You're okay, you always are." And I hated myself a little for proving him right, because I was okay. Outwardly, I adjusted schedules, I changed plans, I swallowed words before they formed. I told myself that being supportive meant being adaptable. But there's a difference between support and erasure. I started to notice how my role contrasted with everyone else's. His mother was allowed opinions, strong ones. His comfort was prioritized, unquestioned. Even extended family members were accommodated with more care than I was. I was expected to fit in around everyone else's needs. It showed in small rituals. Holidays are planned without consulting me. Guests invited with the assumption I'd host. Financial decisions were discussed as if I were a passive beneficiary rather than an equal contributor. No one said I didn't matter. They just behaved like my consent was a formality. And the most dangerous part was how reasonable it all sounded. Every justification made sense on its own. Together, they formed a system where I existed to maintain equilibrium, not to shape it. I told myself I was choosing peace, but slowly, peace started to feel like an absence. There were moments, quiet ones, when I caught my reflection and barely recognized the person looking back. Not because I'd changed physically, but because my inner life had been compressed. Edited for palatability. I was still kind, still capable, still composed, but I was no longer central in my own story, and the role I'd been assigned didn't require me to be. It required me to be useful, predictable, replaceable. I didn't confront anyone about it. I didn't even name it out loud. Naming things gives them weight, and I wasn't ready for that yet. Instead, I observed. I watched how easily my presence was taken for granted, how rarely my absence was considered, how smoothly decisions moved forward when I stayed quiet, and how briefly things stalled when I didn't. And somewhere in that observation, something shifted, not dramatically, not angrily, just enough for me to understand this. The role they had assigned me was comfortable for everyone except me. And if I stayed in it long enough, it would eventually cost me more than comfort. It would cost me agency. The day everything shifted didn't announce itself. There was no argument, no breaking point that forced clarity. It was quieter than that. It happened on a morning that felt almost empty. No plans, no urgency, just the house settling into its usual rhythm. My husband had already left for work. I was alone in the kitchen, making coffee, moving through familiar motions without thinking. That's when I heard my phone buzz, a message from my mother-in-law. It wasn't unusual for her to text me, but this one was different in tone, polite, almost formal. I was thinking it might be a good idea if we talked soon. There are some practical matters we should align on. Practical matters. Align. Words that sound cooperative but aren't. I stared at the screen longer than necessary, not because I was upset, but because something in me paused. A small internal hesitation that felt new. I didn't reply right away. Instead, I finished my coffee. I sat down. I let the quiet stretch. For the first time in a long while, I didn't rush to reassure. I didn't fill the space. I didn't preemptively agree. I just noticed. I noticed how often conversations like this were framed as logistics rather than choices. How often was I invited to align rather than to decide? How rarely anyone asked what I wanted before assuming what I'd accept. That realization didn't make me angry. It made it clear. I thought about all the moments I'd smoothed over, all the times I'd chosen silence for the sake of ease, all the ways my flexibility had been quietly harvested, and something inside me shifted, not toward confrontation, but toward presence. I replied simply, "Sure, let me know what you had in mind." Neutral, open, unrevealing. The conversation that followed was brief. She mentioned finances, living arrangements, long-term planning, nothing explicit, nothing alarming on its own. But underneath it all was an assumption that my role in these discussions was to accommodate outcomes already leaning in a particular direction. And for the first time, I didn't rush to keep things smooth. I listened. I asked clarifying questions. I took mental notes, not defensively, just attentively. When the exchange ended, I didn't feel relieved. I felt grounded. That was new. Later that evening, my husband mentioned his mother had been thinking a lot lately. He said it casually, like an aside, like something I'd smile at and move past. Instead, I asked him what she'd been thinking about. He hesitated, just for a second. And in that second, I understood something important. There were conversations happening that didn't include me. Decisions were being shaped before they ever reached my ears. And I had been positioned to receive them, not participate in them. The shift wasn't emotional, it was cognitive. I stopped assuming goodwill was enough. I stopped assuming silence preserved harmony. I stopped assuming that being easy meant being safe. That night, lying in bed, I didn't feel fear. I felt focused. I realized that whatever was coming next wouldn't announce itself loudly. It would unfold through suggestion, implication, and timing. And if I wanted to understand it, I needed to stay very still, very observant. That was the day something shifted. Not in them, in me. After that day, my silence changed shape. Before, it had been reflexive, a habit built from years of smoothing edges and choosing peace. Now, it was deliberate, measured, observational. I still didn't confront anyone. I didn't announce a boundary or demand explanations. From the outside, nothing looked different. That was important, because when silence is mistaken for weakness, it becomes cover. I started listening differently, not just to what was said, but to what was avoided. I noticed how often my mother-in-law spoke in hypotheticals, ideas framed as possibilities that somehow solidified into expectations by the end of the conversation. I was just thinking, maybe it would make sense if, no pressure, of course. Each phrase carried an escape hatch, plausible deniability. If challenged, she could always retreat into innocence. So I didn't challenge her. I asked questions instead, calm ones, clarifying ones, questions that sounded cooperative but required specificity. When would that start? How would that affect our current arrangement? What assumptions are we making there? She answered easily at first, confidently, until the questions began to stack, until the implications became harder to gloss over. That's when she started deferring to my husband. And that's when I learned something else. He wasn't fully aware of the direction things were moving in, not because he was being deceived, but because he'd never had to track the details. He trusted that things would work out, that everyone had good intentions. I had been protecting that belief for him, buffering discomfort, translating impact into neutrality. I stopped doing that. Instead, I let things land as they were. I didn't soften statements. I didn't reinterpret tone. I repeated words back exactly as they'd been said, and watched how the room reacted. People reveal a lot when they hear their own assumptions spoken aloud. Still, I stayed calm. I stayed agreeable enough to avoid suspicion. I didn't signal resistance, and that's what made everyone underestimate me further. They assumed my quiet meant I was processing slowly, catching up, accepting reality. They didn't realize I was documenting it, not in any official way, just in my notebook. Dates, phrases, patterns. Not to build a case, but to build clarity. There's a difference. Clarity doesn't need anger to fuel it. It just needs consistency. I noticed how often my name was absent from plans that directly affected me. How often were they framed as time-sensitive only after they were nearly final? How often my husband said, "I thought you'd be okay with it," instead of asking. And I noticed my own response. I stopped filling the silence. I let pauses stretch just long enough to feel slightly uncomfortable. Long enough for others to reveal more than they intended. Long enough for assumptions to echo. Silence, when chosen, creates space, and space invites truth. By the time anyone realized something was different, it was already too late to reframe me. They had grown used to my quiet, comfortable with it, dependent on it. They didn't know that the version of me they relied on, the flexible one, the easy one, was being carefully retired, not with drama, with precision. What they never noticed was how much ground you can cover when no one is watching you closely. Because once people decide you're harmless, they stop monitoring you. They speak freely. They assume continuity. They build plans on the belief that tomorrow will look like yesterday. That assumption became my greatest advantage. I didn't change my routine. I didn't withdraw or act distant. I still attended family dinners, still nodded at familiar comments, still responded politely to suggestions framed as favors. But behind that surface, I started preparing. Quietly, methodically. I began by getting very clear on the structure of my life, financially, legally, practically. Not because I planned to leave, but because I wanted to understand what leaving would mean if it ever became necessary. Knowledge creates options. Ignorance creates dependency. I reviewed documents I hadn't looked at in years. Not obsessively, just thoroughly. Account statements, ownership records, agreements I'd once skimmed because trust felt sufficient at the time. I noticed things I hadn't noticed before. I also paid attention to language. Who referred to what as ours? Who used mine? Who said family assets when they meant something far more specific? And I wrote it all down. Not emotionally, not narratively. Just facts. Dates, statements, decisions. Who was present? Who wasn't? The notebook stayed slim because I didn't record everything, only what repeated. Patterns are quieter than events, but they're far more honest. At the same time, I started repositioning myself in subtle ways. I became slightly less available, not dramatically, just enough to stop being the automatic solution. I let small inconveniences exist instead of absorbing them. I declined a few things I would have previously rearranged my life to accommodate. Each time, no one protested. They adjusted. That told me everything I needed to know. I also stopped explaining myself. No long justifications, no emotional framing, just neutral statements. I won't be able to do that. That doesn't work for me. I'll need more time to consider. Simple sentences are disarming when people expect elaboration. And still, no one noticed, because they were busy watching each other, negotiating their own positions, assuming mine was fixed. I listened carefully when my mother-in-law talked about contingency plans, about what-ifs, about how things might need to change in the future. I listened even more carefully when my husband deferred to her without realizing he was doing it. Not to judge him, to understand him. There's a moment in preparation when fear could take over, when you realize how much you didn't know before. I didn't let myself go there. I stayed steady. This wasn't about plotting. It was about readiness, because whatever was unfolding, I could feel its direction. Not in specifics yet, but in intent. And intent always leaves traces. By the time the pieces started coming together, I wasn't surprised. I was ready. The reveal didn't happen all at once. There was no single sentence, no dramatic discovery that snapped everything into focus. It unfolded the way truth often does, quietly through alignment. Separate details suddenly pointing in the same direction. The moment that tipped it from concern into certainty came late one evening, long after my husband had fallen asleep. I was sitting alone at the dining table, my notebook open but untouched. I wasn't writing anymore. I was rereading. Dates, conversations, the same phrases appear months apart, spoken by different people, carrying the same implication. That's when I realized something unsettling. The conversations weren't exploratory. They were preparatory. What I had taken for thinking out loud wasn't uncertainty, it was rehearsal. Ideas are being tested for resistance. Boundaries are being nudged to see if they'd hold. And mine hadn't. I replayed recent interactions in my head, this time without softening them, without translating intent into innocence, without assuming I was included simply because I was present. That's when the shape of it became undeniable. They weren't planning with me. They were planning around me. The most sobering part wasn't the logistics, it was the timeline. This wasn't sudden. It wasn't reactive. It had been building slowly, patiently, on the assumption that I wouldn't interrupt it. And then came the realization that settled everything. If I did nothing, the outcome was already decided. Not maliciously, not with hatred, but with efficiency. That's what made it so clear. People don't scheme loudly when they believe something is inevitable. They speak casually, confidently, as if the ending is already written. I didn't cry. I didn't feel betrayed in the cinematic sense. What I felt was something colder and steadier. Clarity. I finally understood my position in their narrative. I wasn't a partner whose needs had to be negotiated. I was a variable to be minimized, an obstacle to be gently removed. And the reason it worked so well was that I had been cooperative, predictable, quiet. That night, I closed my notebook and didn't add anything new. I didn't need to. I had what I came for, not leverage yet, but understanding. And understanding changes how you stand in a room, even when you don't move. From that point on, I stopped wondering if something was happening. I started asking myself what I was going to do about it, not in anger, in strategy. Because once you see the full picture, you don't rush, you don't panic. You choose. Once you see something clearly, you can't unsee it. But clarity doesn't demand immediate action. It demands deliberate action. I gave myself time, not to doubt what I knew, but to consider my options without fear, steering the wheel. There were several paths available to me. I laid them out quietly, like pieces on a board. I could confront them, ask direct questions, force everything into the open, and insist on renegotiation. That path promised honesty, but it also promised resistance, defensiveness, revision of facts, a sudden collective amnesia about things that had been said and implied. I could do nothing. Continue playing my role and hope the shape of the future softens. That option required the least effort in the short term and the highest cost in the long run. Or I could act without announcing myself. Prepare an outcome that didn't depend on their understanding, agreement, or remorse. Only one of those options was irreversible. And irreversible doesn't mean cruel, it means final. I thought about my husband carefully, not idealized, not villainized, just accurately. He wasn't plotting against me in the way people imagine betrayal. He was passive where passivity benefited him. He deferred when decision-making felt uncomfortable. He trusted his mother because it was easier than questioning her. And he trusted me because I had never forced him not to. I realized something else then, something sobering. If I confronted him now, I would be teaching him how to adapt the plan. If I revealed what I knew, I would give them the opportunity to correct course just enough to protect themselves. Silence in this moment wasn't avoidance. It was protection. So I made my decision quietly, without ceremony. I chose the path that didn't require permission. The path that didn't rely on anyone else suddenly became more ethical, more self-aware, or more honest than they'd ever been before. I chose to secure my position before they finalized theirs. That decision didn't feel triumphant. It felt sober, grounded, almost mundane. I didn't hate them. I didn't even resent them the way people expect. What I felt was resolve, the kind that settles deep and steady without adrenaline. From that moment on, everything I did had intention behind it, even when it looked like nothing at all. I stopped wondering how to be understood. I started focusing on how to be untouchable. Moving in silence doesn't mean doing nothing. It means doing everything without signaling intent. Once I made my decision, I became careful in a new way. Not cautious, careful. There's a difference. Caution is reactive. Carefulness is structured. It assumes time is on your side if you don't waste it. I didn't rush. Rushing leaves traces. Instead, I broke my plan into layers. Each layer could stand alone. Each one made sense, even if nothing else followed. That way, no single action would look suspicious, emotional, or abrupt. The first layer was administrative. I began separating my understanding of our life from the version that existed in conversation. I updated the records quietly, ensured I had access to everything I was legally entitled to, not aggressively, not secretly, just responsibly. Things any reasonable adult could do. I framed it to myself as housekeeping, because that's what it was. There's something grounding about paperwork. It doesn't lie, it doesn't soften the tone, it doesn't pretend. It either exists or it doesn't. It either includes you or it doesn't. And for the first time, I saw clearly where I stood. The second layer was financial, but not dramatic. No hidden withdrawals, no sudden changes that would set off alarms. I simply began ensuring autonomy. Independence isn't separation, it's insurance. I reviewed my contributions, not just money, but labor, time, emotional management, the invisible work that keeps households functioning smoothly, work that disappears the moment it stops being done. I haven't stopped doing it yet. I just noticed how much of it was mine. The third layer was social. This one mattered more than I expected. I stopped filtering information on their behalf, not lying, not exposing, just not smoothing. If my husband missed something important, I didn't remind him. If his mother assumed I'd handle something, I let the assumption sit unanswered until it had to be addressed. And when it was, I responded neutrally. Oh, I didn't realize that was mine to manage. I thought you had that covered. I wasn't included in that conversation. Not accusations, statements. Each one recalibrated expectations just enough to create friction, but not enough to raise suspicion. They felt the shift before they understood it. What they interpreted as a distraction was actually disengagement. Not emotional withdrawal, strategic absence. I was still present, still polite, still functioning, but I was no longer over-functioning. That's when the system began to strain, because systems built on invisible labor collapse when that labor becomes visible by its absence. The fourth layer was emotional discipline. This was the hardest part. I had to resist the urge to react, to test them, to see if they'd notice, to provoke reassurance. I didn't. Reactions create data for the other side. Silence starves them of it. Instead, I practiced neutrality so consistently that it became my default. Calm responses, measured tone, no defensiveness, no sarcasm, no hints that I knew more than I said. Inside, I felt clear. Outside, I felt unreadable. People underestimate unreadable women. They assume neutrality is confusion, that composure is compliance, that patience is delayed. They don't realize it's positioning. As weeks passed, small consequences began surfacing. My husband seemed slightly unsettled, though he couldn't explain why. He asked if everything was okay, not with concern, but with a kind of ambient uncertainty, as if the room felt different and he couldn't identify the draft. I'm fine, I said honestly, because I was. My mother-in-law became more directive, not less. That told me she sensed slippage. People who rely on control increase pressure when it stops working. I met that pressure with calm logistics. When exactly? According to which agreement? Based on what assumption? Each question slowed momentum. Each one required justification. And justification reveals intent. At the same time, I made sure nothing about my behavior suggested exit. I didn't threaten. I didn't hint. I didn't emotionally detach in ways that could be framed as instability. I was steady. That steadiness protected me. Because when people decide to rewrite reality, they need a story. They need a narrative that explains why they're doing what they're doing. I wasn't giving them one. No mood swings, no outbursts, no visible dissatisfaction, just quiet competence. And that made it impossible to paint me as irrational later. Another layer formed naturally: documentation. Not in a dramatic, legal drama way, just consistency. Emails saved, messages archived. Conversations were summarized privately in my notebook. I didn't annotate feelings, I recorded facts. Dates, times, wording. Truth doesn't need adjectives. There was a strange peace in that process. Not because it was empowering in the cinematic sense, but because it was grounding. It anchored me in reality when conversations tried to float away into interpretation. I no longer questioned myself. That alone changed everything. Then came the subtle shifts in power. I noticed that when I didn't immediately agree, discussions stalled. When I didn't volunteer solutions, problems lingered. When I didn't absorb tension, it redistributed, usually between them. That's when I understood something fundamental. I hadn't been peripheral. I had been central, just unacknowledged. And once I stepped slightly out of that center, the imbalance became visible. Still, I said nothing. Because silence at this stage wasn't about hiding. It was about letting structures reveal themselves. I wasn't trying to win. I was letting inevitability do the work. The most important thing I did during this time wasn't external at all. It was internal. I stopped imagining outcomes where they suddenly understood me, where conversations resolved everything cleanly, where fairness emerged organically. I let go of the fantasy of recognition. That freed me completely. Because once you stop needing to be understood by people who benefit from misunderstanding you, you become unmanageable. I wasn't moving toward confrontation. I was moving toward completion. Quietly, precisely, on my own terms. And they still had no idea. Consequences don't always arrive like punishment. Sometimes they arrive in confusion. The first sign that something had shifted for them wasn't anger or accusation. It was disorientation. Small disruptions that didn't have obvious causes. Tasks that used to resolve themselves suddenly didn't. Decisions that once felt effortless now stalled mid-sentence. They didn't connect those moments to me. That was the point. My husband started missing details. Appointments overlapped. Things he assumed were handled weren't. Not because I sabotaged anything, but because I stopped compensating. I let responsibility sit where it belonged. At first, he laughed it off. "Guess we're both a little scattered lately," he said once, smiling at me like this was a shared oversight. I returned the smile, because it was shared now. My mother-in-law noticed next. She began following up on things she'd previously assumed were done, asking questions she'd never asked before. "Did you take care of? Were you able to handle?" I thought we agreed. Each question carried a faint edge of uncertainty. Not blame yet, but awareness. I answered calmly, precisely. I wasn't asked to. That wasn't communicated to me. I don't recall agreeing to that. No defensiveness, no explanation beyond the truth. What unsettled them wasn't my refusal, it was my consistency. When systems rely on one person's unacknowledged labor, they function smoothly until that labor becomes visible by its absence. Then everyone scrambles, not because something new is happening, but because something old has stopped. The atmosphere changed subtly. Conversations grew more careful. Words were chosen more deliberately. There was an unspoken recalibration happening in real time. They didn't know what had triggered it. They just knew something no longer moved automatically. My husband started checking in more often. Not emotionally, logistically. "Did you already do this? Were you planning to handle that? Should we talk about this first?" Each question marked a shift, a recognition that assumptions were no longer safe. But recognition doesn't equal understanding. My mother-in-law, on the other hand, moved in a different direction. She increased her presence. More visits, more opinions, more urgency. Control often tightens before it breaks. She began framing her suggestions with concern, with practicality, with what she called foresight. "I just want to make sure you're both protected. We need to think long-term. This is about stability." I listened, and for the first time, I noticed how often stability was defined without me in mind. Still, I didn't react. I let the consequences continue unfolding naturally. I didn't correct misunderstandings unless directly asked. I didn't offer reassurance unless it was earned. And slowly, the emotional labor I'd once provided as a default began to show up on their plates. They felt it as friction, as inefficiency, as something being off, not as an injustice. People rarely recognize fairness by its absence. They recognize comfort, and comfort was leaving the room. What they didn't know was that nothing irreversible had happened yet. But the momentum had shifted, and momentum, once lost, is difficult to regain. By the time they realized something was wrong, they were already asking the wrong questions. They weren't asking what changed. They were asking how to restore what used to work. And that distinction mattered, because what used to work had only worked for them. The first real sign of panic came disguised as concern. My mother-in-law suggested a family conversation. Not urgent, she said, just necessary, a chance to get everyone on the same page again. Again implied a previous alignment that had never truly existed. I agreed to meet, not because I felt obligated, but because I wanted to observe. There's clarity in watching people try to fix something without acknowledging what they broke. The conversation was polite, careful, full of generalities. She spoke about communication, about misunderstandings, about how families sometimes lose their rhythm and need to reset. My husband nodded along, visibly relieved that there was a script, that this could be framed as a temporary disruption rather than a fundamental shift. They wanted reassurance. I didn't give it. Instead, I responded the same way I had for weeks, factually. I don't feel miscommunicated with. I've been responding to what's been asked of me. I'm comfortable with how things are right now. Each sentence landed softly and destabilized the narrative they were trying to rebuild. My mother-in-law's smile tightened, just slightly. Because if I wasn't upset, then there was nothing to smooth over. And if there was nothing to smooth over, then the problem wasn't emotional. It was structural. That's when the pressure increased. Subtle guilt entered the room. Mentions of effort, of everything that had been done for the family. Implications that my neutrality was creating distance. Don't you want us to feel close again? She asked gently. It was the first time the word want had been directed at me in weeks. I considered it carefully before answering. I want clarity, I said. The room went quiet. Clarity is threatening to people who rely on ambiguity. From that point on, the tone shifted. Not openly, but internally. They began trying to recover ground, reinsert assumptions, restore old patterns. My husband became more attentive, but not more accountable. He tried to be kinder without addressing the imbalance, present without questioning the framework. It was too late, because once you stop filling a role, stepping back into it feels like erasure. And I had already stepped out. They didn't know exactly when it happened. That's what unsettled them most. There was no moment they could point to and say, this is where we lost her. The truth was, they lost access to me gradually, by never fully acknowledging me at all. By the time they tried to fix it, they were asking me to return to a version of myself that no longer existed. And I wasn't angry. I was finished. The confrontation didn't happen the way confrontations usually do. There was no buildup of rage, no rehearsed speech, no moment where my voice shook or my hands trembled. It happened because there was nothing left to avoid. We were sitting at the table, just the three of us, the same table where so many decisions had been discussed around me instead of with me. The familiarity of it made the moment almost ironic. My mother-in-law spoke first, carefully. She framed her words like fragile glass. I feel like there's distance, she said, and I don't understand where it's coming from. I let the silence sit, not to punish, to allow honesty to surface without interruption. My husband looked between us, visibly tense. He wanted resolution, closure, a way to make the room feel normal again. Finally, I spoke. There's no distance, I said calmly. There's just accuracy. They both looked at me, confused. For a long time, I continued. I adjusted, I accommodated. I stayed flexible because I thought that was what kept things peaceful. I didn't accuse. I didn't list grievances. I didn't raise my voice. I realize now that what I was actually doing was making it easier for everyone else not to consider me. My husband started to respond. An apology forming, quick and instinctive, but I held up my hand gently. Please don't rush to fix this, I said. I'm not upset. That was the part they didn't expect. I explained briefly and without emotion what I had observed, how decisions had been made, how assumptions had replaced conversations, how my silence had been interpreted as consent. I didn't dramatize it. I didn't assign motives. I spoke as if I were describing a system, not people, and that made it impossible to argue with. My mother-in-law attempted to soften it, to contextualize, to explain intentions. I know, I said. Intentions aren't the issue. That sentence ended the negotiation. Because once impact is acknowledged, intention loses its protective power. My husband was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower. I didn't realize, he said. I know, I replied. That's part of the problem. There was no explosion, no tears, no dramatic reckoning. Just a quiet understanding that something fundamental had changed and couldn't be reset with reassurance. I wasn't asking for permission. I wasn't asking for validation. I wasn't asking for change. I was informing them. And when the conversation ended, I felt lighter than I had in years. Not because I'd won, but because I'd finally spoken from a place where I didn't need anything back. I don't think of that period of my life as something I survived. I think of it as something I outgrew. Who I am now isn't louder. I didn't become sharper or more confrontational. I didn't replace patience with bitterness or calm with suspicion. What changed was my center. I no longer orient myself around being understood. I orient myself around being aligned with my values, my boundaries, my reality. I still listen, still observe, still choose my words carefully, but I no longer disappear inside that care. Silence for me now isn't default, it's optional. When I speak, it's because I want to, not because the room needs smoothing. When I agree, it's conscious, not assumed. When I pause, it's because I'm choosing clarity over speed. I've learned that being underestimated isn't always a disadvantage. It gives you room, it reveals character. It shows you how people behave when they think you don't matter enough to account for. And I don't resent those who misunderstood me. Resentment would mean they still occupy space inside me. They don't. My relationship with my husband changed in ways that were uncomfortable but necessary. He had to confront his own passivity, without me translating it into kindness for him. That wasn't easy for either of us. But it was real. As for my mother-in-law, our interactions are now measured, polite, boundaried. She no longer assumes access to my time, my labor, or my compliance. Not because I demanded it loudly, but because I stopped offering it freely. I didn't need to punish anyone. I just stopped subsidizing systems that depended on my silence. What I carry forward isn't vigilance, it's self-trust. The quiet certainty that I don't need permission to take up space in my own life. I know now that peace built on erasure isn't peace at all, and I won't return to it. I used to believe that being patient meant being good, that if I stayed calm long enough, flexible enough, understanding enough, the people around me would eventually meet me in the middle. That harmony was something you earned by minimizing yourself just enough to keep everyone comfortable. I don't believe that anymore. What I learned, slowly, quietly, is that silence doesn't protect you unless it's chosen. And even then, it only protects you if it's paired with awareness. Otherwise, it becomes a language other people translate however it suits them. This story was never about being pushed out of a home. It was about being slowly edited out of my own life, not through cruelty, but through convenience. Not through hatred, but through assumption. Through people deciding, without ever asking, that my presence was optional as long as my usefulness remained. And the hardest part to accept wasn't what they planned. It was how possible it became only because I had made myself so easy to overlook. There's a particular kind of grief that comes from realizing you participated in your own erasure, not because you were weak, but because you were trying to be kind, trying to be reasonable, trying to keep things smooth. That grief doesn't explode. It settles, and once it settles, it asks you a question you can't ignore anymore. What does it cost me to stay this way? I didn't reclaim my life through confrontation or exposure. I didn't need dramatic proof or public validation. I reclaimed it by stepping out of roles I never consciously accepted and refusing to return to them. Quietly, permanently. The people in the story didn't lose me because I was angry. They lost access to me because I became accurate. And accuracy changes everything. If there's one thing I hope you take from this, it's this. Being agreeable is not the same as being respected. And being silent is not the same as being safe. You don't need to announce your boundaries for them to be real. You don't need permission to step out of a narrative that diminishes you. And you don't owe anyone the version of you that made their life easier at your expense. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do isn't to speak louder. It's to stop explaining. Before we end, I want to ask you something slowly, honestly. Have you ever looked back and realized that the moment you stopped being easy was the moment you finally became free? If that resonates with you, I'd really like to hear your thoughts in the comments.
Cảm ơn các bạn vì đã theo dõi đến cuối. Đừng quên ấn like, share và bật chuông để không bỏ lỡ những video mới nhất nhé. Hẹn gặp lại.